Good afternoon, my name is Dave Norton from Discovering New England History, and we're going to bring you episode 6 of the Road to Andersonville story. So we'll go to the next slide. And from our last episode, we finished at Andersonville. Clara Barton went down there with Dorrance Atwater and a group of 42 Union soldiers, and they put all these wooden headboards on over 12,000 veterans from the Union that died at Andersonville prison. I'll go to the next slide. And she went down there and she raised the American flag and had a ceremony, and it was all done. This was back in August 1865. We'll go to the next slide. Now, it's not over yet for Dorrance Atwater and Clara Barton. Andersonville death list case. Now, the problem with this is all these individuals were involved. Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War, Colonel Samuel Beck, Adjutant General, Major General James Wilson, Assistant Quartermaster, Andrew Johnson, who was now the President of the United States because Lincoln had been assassinated, Horace Greeley, a famous name, he was founded the New York Tribune, and Benjamin Butler, who became the governor of Massachusetts. They're all involved in this because they knew that Dorrance Atwater kept a secret list of all the dead at Andersonville, and they wanted it destroyed. We'll go to the next slide. Now, Dorrance Atwater, as you recall, as they buried each one of the prisoners, you had to keep all the records of them for the Confederates. And that's what he did. When they laid them in the trench, then he put down their name and the units they were in and which state they were from. But he kept a second copy, secret copy, and at the end of the day, no one knew he was keeping that, and he would sew it inside the inside of his Union jacket and just go back into the camp at the end of the day. Go to the next slide. Now, when the General Sherman was marching south, the Confederates were getting nervous that he was going to discover all the conditions at Andersonville, so they started taking all the prisoners and sending them to other Civil War camps all over the South. And Dorrance Atwater was sent to the Florence Stockade, South Carolina, and he kept hidden his death list. Now, that looks almost like Andersonville, but it's not. It's got a larger creek running through the center of the fort or the stockade, and you can see that there they had to get a bridge to get over that creek. So it's, but it's still, prisoners were confined in the open and still had miserable conditions. And the worst of it is that they were so debilitated at Andersonville that when they came here, it made it that much harder to survive. Go to the next slide. And you can see what they did. This was hard labor. So those that were very healthy, they would send them out every day in a wood gathering detail, which they used for fires there for cooking. And you can see that's a great sketch there of Florence, South Carolina, as Civil War is getting near the end. We'll go to the next slide. And you can say, oh, great, they got a couple buildings there in Florence. Well, they did. And here's one of them that they used for the hospital. This was in September now. And you can see what they are. I mean, it's amazing there. They just took them and just threw them in there. But they did get some protection from the elements. We'll go to the next slide. Now, not too many sketches of Florence, but I found a few here. On the left, it shows them all lining up with a small house there, trying to get food. And on the right, what happened is now it's getting near the end of the war, and they went through a parole. They were going to send them all home. The war is over, whatever. And at Florence, Carolina, what they did is they took the worst of them and they sent them out like this. So they inspected them all, and the worst they sent them out to get out of the prison so it wouldn't look so bad. Go to the next slide. And then in May of 1865, of course, the Civil War was over in April, General James Wilson finally came to the gates of Andersonville to liberate the soldiers. And of course, a lot of them were already gone. And that's his, that was the headquarters of Henry Wirtz there over on the right. And when he was there, they went through it and they found a list, the dead list. That's a list that the Confederates had, the good list. So they captured that. Go to the next slide. Now we're getting into these other folks here. The federal government wanted, okay, they got one list. Then they found out that Dorrance Atwater had a secret list. They wanted control of both of those lists so that Dorrance would never be able to publish them in the newspaper to tell the families what happened to all their sons that were in Andersonville. The war was over. They wanted to heal everything. That was the whole intention. So Dorrance Atwater was hunted by the federal government, if you will. And they had no intention of ever publishing the death list. And these folks, Edward Stanton, Colonel Samuel Breck, Major General Wilson, were involved in this. Well, the next slide. And of course, they went to his house, raided his house, searching for it, and they didn't find it. That's a copy of what one of the pages of the list looks like. It's unclear whether he gave it to Clara Barton and she took it to Massachusetts and her home and hid it for him. That evidence is lost to history. We'll go to the next slide. But since he was still in the Army, he wasn't discharged yet, they court-martialed him under the grounds of stealing government property. That list, in their view, was government property, and he would not turn it over to them. He knew if he held on to it at some point in time, he could get it to a newspaper. So after all he's been through, he was at prison in Belle Isle, down in Virginia, then he was in Andersonville, then he was at this other prison in Florence, South Carolina. He suffered malaria and dysentery and everything else and gradually healed from those problems. And his mother died, then his father died right at the time he was released. Then for all his efforts in saving this list, they sent him to New York State, Auburn State Penitentiary, their prison right here. That's a picture of it. September 1865. And he was sentenced to 18 months of hard labor. Can you imagine that, for all he's done for the United States? We'll go to the next slide. Now you got these same folks here. Clara Barton is the one that helped because she was involved in the missing soldiers office. And her idea was to find the fate of all the Union soldiers that did not come home to all the towns. Andrew Johnson was president then. Horace Greeley got involved. Now he was someone else from Massachusetts, and he founded the New York Tribune. And apparently she befriended him, and he was really interested in publishing this if he could get that list. And Benjamin Butler, the governor of Massachusetts, of course, he was a Union general, and he was involved to try to help get that list published. This was in November of 1865. What they did is they all got together and they said, look, Dorrance Atwater is a prisoner now. Look what he's went through. He's got the list hidden somewhere. Let's get him out of that prison in New York. So she basically, Clara Barton had powerful friends in high places, and they released him from prison after only 3 months of hard labor. We'll go to the next slide. Now, at the same time, November 1865, Captain Henry Wirtz was tried for crimes during the Civil War. That's a picture of him there, and it took him to Washington, D.C. They had right in front of the Capitol area that way. They put up and they hung him for all his crime. He's the only one that was actually hung for all the problems that they had at Andersonville. And go to the next slide. Now, a year later, after all of this, Dorrance Atwater still has not given up his list. Now he's free. But with the help of Clara Barton, they got a hold of Horace Greeley at the New York Tribune, and in 1866, they published it in the New York Tribune, and all the papers got it, finally. This was amazing. 12,000 families were notified, at least had closure. We'll go to the next slide. And this is amazing. I found this poster here. A year later, in 1867, Clara Barton, of course, was friends with Dorrance Atwater. And they got together, and what they did is they went all the way around New England from different towns and whatever, and had different lectures. They went on a lecture tour to tell everybody about what happened in Andersonville. And on the left there's actually someone had a copy of this with their signatures on it, Western Railroad. They were taking the trains all around New England, and their names are both on there as a pass on the train. But if you take a look on the right, you can see I put in red Dorrance Atwater, and of course Clara Barton. Lectures are described as the work and incidents of Army life. This was in 1867. And we'll go to the next slide. Now this is the most, probably anyway, the most significant poster with the most information that I came across. This was a year later, March of 1868, and Dorrance Atwater was by himself on the lecture tour. He certainly didn't get rich, charged 25 cents a person to listen, but this was done at Congregational Church in not Plymouth, Massachusetts, it's Plymouth, Connecticut, March 10th, 1868. And in the fine print there, which a lot of times I don't read when I research, I'm going to have to read this to you when it's on the next slide, and you're going to be amazed at what this says. Go to the next slide. So I'll read it to you. That's a copy of the print on the left of the Congregational Church, Plymouth, Connecticut, March 10th, 1868. Here we go. This is on the poster. Mr. Atwater was taken prisoner of war in July 1863 near Hagerstown, Maryland. He was confined in 5 different prisons at Richmond, also Belle Isle, Salisbury, and Andersonville. At Andersonville, he was detailed to keep a record of deaths of Union prisoners for the rebel authorities. While doing so, he managed to secretly copy and bring away a copy of all of our 13,000 dead in Andersonville. Now this here is amazing. I'm not sure many people really understand what he had. He brought with him artifacts from Andersonville. I'm not sure too many people know that. A collection of relics brought from Andersonville by Miss Clara Barton and Mr. Atwater will be exhibited. And look what he brought from Andersonville: cooking utensils and dishes, pieces of the notorious Deadline, headboards, one of the headboards that they had, I guess, extra headboards, and a mailbox. And he also had with him right here in his lecture in his church the original copy that he had of the Andersonville Dead List. Unbelievable. We'll go to the next slide. Now, in Terryville, Connecticut, which is right next to Plymouth, discovered this. They have a big monument to him, and there's a large cannon with the cannonballs and everything else, to Dorrance Atwater, Terryville, Connecticut. And of course, I visited that, and that is amazing. What a tribute to this young fella. He was only 16 when he lied about his age to go in the Union Army, and he went through all of this, and he was only at 21, I guess, when he finally published the record. And we'll go to the next slide. And this is the sign that they had there on the town green in Terryville. And I'll read that. Captured by the Confederates and sent to the prisoner of war camp at Andersonville, Georgia, Atwater kept a secret list of the 13,000 Union soldiers who died there after the war. He and Clara Barton returned to properly mark the graves of the dead. That's at Andersonville. Clara Barton came to Terryville, so she was in Connecticut, right in Terryville, for the 1895 centennial. That was a big honoring the centennial in this town. And she was also came a second time in 1907 for the dedication of this monument. So if you ever get to Terryville, Connecticut, you can stand right on that monument where Clara Barton and Dorrance Atwater were together. That's an important part of Connecticut history, New England history, and United States history. We'll go to the next slide. Now, when I was down at Andersonville, we're going to recap a little bit here. Here's where the trench where they're all buried, and this is where my wife's relative, James Strawn, I had her stand right there next to his gravesite, just to give you an idea how many were buried in front of him here in just one lane. And we'll go to the next shot. And I went back in the book and I said, oh my gosh, one of the most famous pictures of Andersonville, which is on the left. And I looked at the trees in the back and looked at the trees in the back of my picture I took in 2016. I said, my gosh, that's very close to where that actual photograph was taken in 1864. And it is. I had it verified. And the aisle next to it to the left is where this picture in 1864 was taken. So that's kind of an important part of history there. Kevin Fry is he has an Andersonville site that a lot of members are on Facebook, and he's very, very helpful to me in verifying these two photos. And I have a lot to thank for him. He's a great help to our family. And we'll go to the next slide. And there's a picture. That's my wife. There's a picture of James Strawn, number 4555. You can see all the other ones behind him. That's a very small section. It's just vast. And we're the only ones in the family that ever went down to Andersonville since he was buried there during the Civil War. We'll go to the next slide. And we saw this one. That's a Connecticut monument at Andersonville. Very impressive monument. Very impressive. And they actually made a duplicate of that in Hartford, Connecticut, which I haven't had an opportunity to check it out since I was here and found this one here. I found that out. Whoever designed and installed this, they duplicated it, and it's near the State House in Hartford, Connecticut. That's a terrific monument to all those that died at Andersonville from Connecticut. We'll go to the next slide. And this picture I found, they had a dedication of this monument in Connecticut, and all the surviving soldiers from Connecticut that were in Andersonville all went down there, all got together. And you can see at the center of that picture there, that's the statue of the Union soldier there. And they were right there at that monument for the dedication. Great piece of history. I wish we knew the names of all those gentlemen there that were Union veterans. We'll go to the next slide. Now, other monuments. Captain Wirtz. There's this picture on the right, and that's a monument to him, believe it or not, in a small, I call it a village of Andersonville, and that's right in the middle of the square there to, the Confederates honored him, and he was the Confederate leader at Andersonville. We'll go to the next slide. And I often wondered about this. I took James Strawn, he's from Thomaston, Connecticut. That's his picture on the upper left, and that's his actually his memorial at the cemetery in Thomaston. You can see that indicated on there that he died at Andersonville. On the right, of course, is Dorrance Atwater. He did not die at Andersonville. But the two of them, I said, wait a minute. Dorrance Atwater was born in Terryville, Connecticut. James Strong was born in Thomaston, Connecticut. I got a picture in the old family pictures there of his house where James Strong was born. And then the picture on the right, I went out and took that picture, found his house, which is still there in Terryville. Did a little bit of a search, and those two houses are only, I mean, they're two towns, but I'll tell you how close together they're only like 4 or 5 miles difference between the two. I often wondered if they had a chance to meet each other at Andersonville. And you really never know, because when you're a prisoner of war, that's the thing. When new prisoners keep on coming in, who's from Connecticut, who's from my hometown, let me know what's going on there. And they traded all that kind of information, but I will never know that information, and it's lost to history. We'll go to the next slide. There's a close-up there, James Strong, 2nd Connecticut Volunteer Heavy Artillery. And we'll go to the next slide. Dorrance Atwater. Well, after he published his list, I guess they gave him an honor. They made him ambassador to Tahiti, probably to get him out of the country, which they didn't. They were still upset about him publishing those lists, where he lived for many years, and that's his where he's buried in Tahiti. He lived for a while in San Francisco, and his apartment was burnt down during a Great Fire in San Francisco. That's where he died, and they shipped him back over to Tahiti, where he lived for many years. And in San Francisco, it said that that's where he kept his original document of Andersonville, and it was burned up in the fire. We'll never know for sure. Well, the next slide. That's what Andersonville looks like today. That's a panoramic view of this. You can imagine this whole field is absolutely filled with prisoners. And we'll go to the next slide. Go to the next slide. And those are the folks we talked about from Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts. Their fate, Chapman and Strawn, they both died at Andersonville. Silas Norton and William Barnum, James Chapman, Dorrance Atwater survived. James Chapman escaped. In Rhode Island, Carpenter and Hunt died, and Curtis was one of the ringleaders of the group in Andersonville, and he was hanged. July 1864, Andrew Durfee survived, Massachusetts. Murphy died, Torrey died in Andersonville. William Walker supposedly died there with an unknown marker, and David Dean survived. Those are a lot of the folks that we talked about in this story. And we'll go to the next slide. Now, we're going to go down there and just kind of recap here. What's the story of some of these, and how were they captured? Because a lot of that is lost to history. So Dorrance Atwater, we covered a lot of his story. At Hagerstown, Maryland, he was there. He was a courier during the war. On July 7th, that's right after Gettysburg, 1863, he was captured at Hagerstown, Maryland. They sent him to Belle Isle Prison in Richmond, then to Andersonville Prison in Andersonville, then to the Florence Stockade in Florence, South Carolina, and then, of course, he was sent to the prison in New York after the war. Well, the next slide. Now, Private Patrick Carpenter in Rhode Island Cavalry and Andrew Durfee, they both died at Andersonville, and they were captured at White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia, October 13th, 1863. And Private Andrew Durfee survived Andersonville. He's got a star next to his name there. We'll go to the next slide. Captured in Warrenton, Virginia, November 13, 1863, Private Caleb Hunt from the 1st Rhode Island Cavalry, and that's a picture of the small town where he was captured. Go to the next slide. Private James Chapman, of course, was at Drury's Bluff, Virginia. He was captured May 16, 1864, and he escaped. Go to the next slide. Now, Private Charles Curtis was one of the raiders at Andersonville. I went around killing and stealing from prisoners. Sentenced to death, hung July 11th, 1864. Go to the next slide. Of course, James Strawn with William Walker and David Dean were captured at Cold Harbor, Virginia, at Bloody Run Creek. That's a picture of the creek right there. We'll go to the next slide. Wilderness, Virginia, captured Philip Murphy and Charles Torrey from Massachusetts, May of 1864. We'll go to the next slide. And all those were captured at Plymouth, North Carolina, April of 1864, and they all died at Andersonville, were shipped by train down to Andersonville. Go to the next slide. Of course, Dorrance Atwater, who's a monument to him in Terryville. Go to the next slide. Clara Barton is a monument to her on the left of Andersonville. She's also buried there in a monument of the Founder of American Red Cross, North Cemetery, North Oxford, Massachusetts. Go to the next slide. Some of the items I had, collection of bullets and buttons from different battlefields that I've been at. And we'll go to the next slide. And it's a Civil War Union cartridge pouch, and I've actually had two of those parts of the cartridge pouch in my possession that I got. Nice items to keep. We'll go to the next slide. Those are the memorials from New England at Andersonville, Massachusetts, of course, Clara Barton, Rhode Island, Maine, and Connecticut. We'll go to the next slide. And the final Andersonville Remembered slide. Every Christmas they put wreaths on all the grave sites. Connecticut, 315 died there. Rhode Island, 74. Massachusetts, 768. Maine, 233. Vermont, 212. New Hampshire, 224. So from England, 1,726 perished. So that's my tribute to Andersonville. And I hope you enjoy the 6 parts to it. I spent a lot of time putting this together, and I learned a lot. So it's Dave Norton, Discovering New England History. Have a good evening.